The New Deal, Chapter 17. And before I start, I want to preface this whole thing with I'm recording this at home, not at school. And I live in an apartment, and I live in downstairs, and the apartment right above me has a 3-year-old in their home right now. And she loves to run and jump. So if you hear a loud thump, don't be alarmed. It's nothing with me. It's my 3-year-old neighbor upstairs. Okay, back to the lesson. We learned last time that during World War I and the 1920s, there was a massive migration of blacks from the South to the North and the Midwestern industrial states. And employment was gained in all industries, and strange as it seems, one of the places for the most resistance to black workers was in the textile industry in the South. But the labor unions are still boycotting black membership. If the blacks were allowed to join, they would be kept segregated from the white workers. In the railroad industry, the change from black workers to white workers after the war was even more dramatic. The firemen and all of them that had been working on the railroad had been black, but not anymore. So as a result of this type of segregation, the Friends of the Negro movement was formed in 1920. Unfortunately, the founders were Northern Yankee radicals. Yes, their goal was to fight racial discrimination in the hiring and boycotting. They used boycotting and tried to form unions to get fair jobs. It was only in existence for 3 years, but it was never able to achieve their goals. Another organization founded by a very well-known black, A. Philip Randolph, called the National Association for the Promotion of Labor Unionism. You know, sometimes these names are longer than the lives of the organization. But it too failed. The American Negro Labor Congress, formed in Chicago in 1925, attempted to unify all organizations of black workers and farmers, and it too failed. All organizations, despite their length in existence, were really seeking the same thing: to get rid of in the workforce the discrimination against the black worker. So why did organizations with such lofty goals and intelligent men at the helm fail? I can tell you in 3 words: disunity, indifference, and hostility. Now, A. Philip Randolph didn't give up. He tried again, this time with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925. And he was attacked as a radical, which in some ways he was. But he managed to gain endorsements from the AFL, the NAACP, and the NUL, which is the National Urban League. And the organization was recognized in 1926. And in 1929, they finally got some agreements, and by 1937, they got some benefits. Now, Mr. Randolph, he's very important. We're going to hear his name all the way through the 1950s and 60s. As a matter of fact, although it's not mentioned in your text, he became vice president of the AFL and CIO in 1957. He was always working hard for his race. But the Southern economy is floundering. Now, we've got a lot of black businesses in the South. But a business's success depends on the financial viability of their clientele. And with a reduction of income in the black communities, the businesses, of course, are going to grow less. And then you have soil erosion, you've got boll weevils, you've got the young black men leaving the farms for the cities. We're being flooded by foreign markets of tobacco and cotton and sugar cane. And those Republicans, in their infinite wisdom, they've passed rather large tariff bills. And with less money to spend, if less money is generated in the black communities, and the purchasing power, black or white, is gone. So exactly what's going on in our nation? It's not just affecting the blacks and the whites, it's affecting the white collars, the blue collars. It's going to affect everybody that walks. In the 1920s, the poverty line was considered to be $2,500. And with that amount of money, you could support a family of 4 or 5. But unfortunately, 60% of the nation's families live below that line. And some of them earning so much less than $2,000, they just couldn't make ends meet. But on the surface, everything looks so good. But wages are falling, and prosperity had bypassed specific groups, namely the Native Americans and Mexican Americans, and of course the black community. And as much as 40% of those earned so much less than $2,000, they couldn't even afford to buy milk for their children. Now, farm prices are depressed. They have been since the end of the war. But that's the way it usually is. But the South has been hit particularly hard by those, boll weevils and crop erosion and thing. And income for a farmer is about 50% of what the city worker earned, which is not really all that unusual. And following along with that, when the rural consumers stopped buying farm implements and tractors and automobiles and furniture, etc., they stopped buying. They began to default on their notes and their loans. And now, back in these days, the bank didn't have any kind of insurance. The only money the bank could operate on was the money it had in the bank. So if you don't pay your bills, repay your loan, the bank doesn't have any money. If the bank doesn't have any money, the bank's going to have to close or fail. No money, no bank. Now, it doesn't matter if you've got a business that's you're making money and you're making regular deposits to the bank. It doesn't matter at all. When that bank shuts its doors, no matter how much money you've got in there, it's gone. And you've been doing good, but now you're going to be among those that are going to have problems. And because of the bank's closing, thousands of small businesses failed because of what I just said, or because they couldn't get loans from the bank. And you and I, the great general mass of consumers, we built up a rather unmanageable amount of consumer installment debt because we just had this new thing come along in the 20s, $1 down, $1 a week. And pretty soon you got more dollars going out than you got coming in. And because of, well, we can't buy anymore, so we cut back on spending for things, and pretty soon, all this shift of the wealth toward the very rich, and all the while the poorest 93% of the non-farmer population begins to see our disposable income fall. But even before the onset of the Depression, the business investments had been falling. They've been pulling back. And as an indicator used in today's economy, the construction of new homes, in 1929, it was less than 50% of what it had been 3 years ago. And of course, the manufacturers had expanded so much. They produced so much. They had warehouses full of stuff. And we've stopped buying. They've got excessive inventory. So why would they pay you to make another refrigerator when they've got a warehouse full of refrigerators? So they start cut off production and lay people off. And of course, the old adage, the last hired be the first fired. That is, unless you were black, because they were always fired first. Then the Federal Reserve, in their infinite wisdom, they played a very critical, although inadvertent, role in weakening the economy. Trying to cut back on the stock market speculation, the first thing they did was slow the growth of the money supply, and then allow the supply to fall after the market crash. So you and I, our consumers, we're finding ourselves unable to repay loans. So instead of actively stimulating the economy by cutting interest rates and expanding the money supply like we do today, the Feds allowed the country's money supply to decline by almost 20% in the next 10 years. And of course, as mentioned a few minutes ago, the Republicans had raised the tariffs, and all it did was call the other people to retaliate against us, and we started losing overseas and international trade 10% a year. And that's a lot of money, folks. And with all this stuff going on in the economy, and while we've been watching the Harlem Renaissance and the new women with their short skirts and their short hair, and watching the Charleston and all the cultural conflicts and talking about sex and teaching evolution, we didn't see what was going on in front of us. And this Depression was going to be the worst economic catastrophe in our history. It hit everyone. Urban, rural, blue and white collar workers, white and black. But even before the Depression, as I said, it's already begun to affect the black community. And by 1934, 17% of whites and 28% of blacks were incapable of self-support. And of course, in the cities, it's even worse. 25 to 40% of blacks needed assistance in the large cities. In Atlanta, Georgia, by 1935, some 65% of the black population needed relief. And is it any surprise that there was massive pessimism among the population? And the prospect of starvation was very, very real. And starvation was aided by the refusal of so many white soup kitchens to serve the blacks. And even when there was financial aid doled out, it was always less for the black man. So for all the optimism that had developed during the Harlem Renaissance, now the realities of life again forced the black man to face the fact that democracy and equality was not to be for him. According to Daniel Webster in the dictionary, regeneration means the bringing forth of a new and higher spiritual nature, a rebirth, especially in a moral sense. So when you see something called the regeneration of the political arena, well, the knowledge that an active involvement in politics was going to happen, and this involvement had to be more than just going to the polls and voting. You had to get involved in political organizations. And with all the migration during the war in the 20s, the largest concentration was, of course, the city of Chicago. And Chicago begins to flex their political muscle. And President Wilson, a Democrat, he had discouraged them, especially with his segregating the blacks in the eating and bathroom areas in D.C., remember? But in both Chicago and New York, blacks were being elected to state offices. And they were appointing blacks to positions like, maybe it was tokenism, but they were being appointed, and oops, there it was, one of them. Blacks began to, shall we say, desert the Republican Party. It was a hard thing for them to do, folks, because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the great emancipator. It was a slow process. But when the Republican Party of the South began to, make the party, shall we say, lily white in their attempt to dethrone the white Democrats, the desertion was on in earnest. The blacks were angry and disillusioned, but what party should they join? Oscar DePriest, black man who had been elected as an alderman in Chicago in 1915, ran for and won the seat in Congress as a black Republican from Chicago. And being the first northern black to serve in our nation's capital, he was in a very unique position. He represented his district, but also his race. And when there were pictures of him in the newspapers of he and his wife attending functions that were white, specifically a White House tea, they were horrified in the South. And the KKK burned him in effigy. And throughout it all, DePriest maintained his cool. He became the symbol of propriety, of decorum, through all three of his terms. And his presence in Washington actually paved the way for other black people to be elected in high offices. And many blacks did remain loyal to the Republican Party because, after all, the best people voted Republican. Because what would be the alternative? The Democratic Party had not been able to make a lot of inroads with them by this time, but what about the Communist Party? Now, even though the Communist Party did target blacks, most of them were unwilling to try it. There were some, of course, just as there were some white people trying it. But during the 1930s, if anyone told you they had a plan for a way to feed your children and get you a job, you're going to listen. Unfortunately, it's going to come back to haunt them in the 40s and 50s. Funny thing was, or odd thing, or what do you want to call it, Russia was inviting them to come over. They were one of the first ones that were invited to come over, and they established schools and trained these blacks in how to become Communist Party leaders. And what they wanted, though, they wanted people with really black skin. They didn't want the light skin. And some of our more educated, higher placed black people have very light skin. Some actually fought for the Red Army during the Russian Revolution. And like I say, some did attend school. Even Claude McKay even went over. They didn't want him at first because he was too black. They wanted somebody, I mean, he wasn't black enough. They wanted somebody who was really black. And for a while, we had several who were from other countries who were black. The Russians wanted the blacker the better because this was going to show them that they were not prejudiced against black people. They weren't really communistic. Like I said, they just wanted to be somewhere where they didn't have to be judged by the color of their skin. Of course, the Russians were wanting to use the color of their skin to judge them. Angelo Herman, a young Birmingham coal miner, joined the Communist Party, recruited others to join. In 1932, he was arrested on insurrection charges. And something called the International Labor Defense League, which is a wing of the Communist Party, did manage to get his release after a 5-year court battle. And the International League of Defense, the ILD, did get involved in another big case called the Scottsboro case. Now, I do have a YouTube about the Scottsboro case, and I think you're going to find it. Dr. Carol, what is her last name? I can't think of it offhand. I've got it I've got it written down on the YouTube. She's sitting at her desk and she's telling you about it, and she does a beautiful job of presenting it. It's through Emory University, and it's not all that long, but I encourage you to listen to the whole thing, and you're going to really enjoy the way she presents it. But the story in a nutshell is March the 25th, 1931. 9 black teens were hoboing on a train and were met by an angry white mob at Paint Rock, Alabama. Now, hoboing is, you look at the time frame, the 1930s, nobody had any money to go anywhere to get a job, so you jump on these cars. Once the train starts, you jump on an empty boxcar and ride it to the next stop. The problem was that sometimes you had these, what we call railroad bulls, which were nothing more than big, beeping white men with clubs that would beat people up, black or white, if you were on the train. But anyway, these 9 black teens were on this train, hoboing. They got into a fight with a bunch of white boys who were hoboing. And when they get to Paint Rock, Alabama, they're being arrested. They're being met by a white mob. They're going to be arrested. And while they're in the process of being arrested, 2 white girls, black men, white girls, Alabama, 1930s. Ooh. Well, the girls accused the boys of rape immediately, and of course later they did recant. But the boys were arrested, taken to Scottsboro, tried, convicted, and sentenced to be electrocuted. These boys are ages from 19 to 13. One so sick he couldn't walk, and one was nearly blind. There were years of court battles that went up and back and forth between Alabama and the Supreme Court. There were 4 trials, all presided over by white Southerners. They were not fair. So in 1937, 4 were finally freed. 1943, 2 get paroled. 1944, 1's paroled. 1946, 1's released, and then 1 escaped and went north. And the nice thing about it is that Michigan refused to extradite him. Like I say, the YouTube will give you a little bit more details, and I wish I could think of Carol's last name, but she is, I would love to have taken a class from her. It's really an interesting presented case. But it's just a demonstration of how bad things were in the 30s, especially if you were black. The Roosevelts. Franklin, Delano, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah, I hate to admit it, but I am old enough to remember them both. Franklin was elected president 4 times, and so many grew up in the 30s and 40s. It's the only president they ever knew. This is a very flattering picture of his wife. Franklin was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was also a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, of the famous Roosevelt, even though Franklin was a Democrat and Teddy was a Republican. When you're that financially, in that financial sphere, you don't have to work for a living. You've got money, so you need to do something. And it was the thing to do is to give back to the public, to go into altruistic or philanthropy or politics. And Franklin chose to go into politics. Unfortunately, he was stricken with polio in 1921, and he thought his life was over. But through exercise and hot baths and encouragement, he did manage to start walking with braces and crutches. But the irony is nobody knew. I mean, very few people knew. That those immediately around him and the press knew, but it was none of the public's business. And even though he was president for so long, and we didn't have television, but we had movies and things, we didn't know he was disabled. He was always standing up, had 2 strong men one on each side of him, or he'd be sitting in a chair talking, and we didn't know. In 1928, his wife persuaded him he could get back into politics, and he ran for and was elected governor of New York. Well, things were going so bad, and President Hoover was not doing a good job. And so the public is always fickle. If the Republicans can't fix this problem, let's try a Democrat. And so they tried and elected Franklin as president in 1932. And the very first thing he did was declare a bank holiday and close all the banks. But if you cut the banks closed, you can't get a run on them. And while they were closed, he worked out a way to save the banks, and thus in the long term, the small businesses. And throughout the entire relief program, and he's going to call it the New Deal, he delivers what's called the fireside chats. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about the power of the radio, if it's used right. People like Hitler and Mussolini and the despots of the Europe, they didn't like the radio because they couldn't control what you're hearing. Roosevelt used it in a great way. And in all honesty, we had visions of him sitting in an easy chair in front of a fireplace with his dog Fally at his feet and Mrs. Roosevelt in the kitchen cooking cookies. Now, of course, this was not the way it happened. I mean, we know now he was sitting behind a desk in his office, and Mrs. Roosevelt never did put foot in the kitchen. But this was what you had in mind, and he started, "My fellow Americans." And he was from New York and had a strange accent, but he kept us informed. He told us about the good things. He told us about the bad things. He told us a story about his little dog, Falla, little black terrier, chewing up a shoe. Or he'd say, like Mrs. Roosevelt dropped one of her good cups yesterday. He'd tell you something to make you feel like you're drawn into his family and funny, and then he'd slip in something that's bad. And of course, his most famous saying, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." But we trusted him, even though he was a Yankee. And his wife, I said that was a very flattering picture of her. She had a tall, dark voice, and she talked kind of funny later on. But she was very shy when she was young. And I guess her uncle was Teddy Roosevelt, and she lived with him a great deal of the times. Her dad partook of the grape a bit too much. And we used to have something called coming out parties where you dressed in white and the virgins were presented to the future husbands. You did this after your grand tour of Europe. And she saw FDR and just fell head over heels in love with him, and he was her cousin. And they got married a year later, and they ended up having 6 children. Well, they had 7, and 1 died. And then when he was stricken with polio, she's the one that nursed him back to health. She helped him every way she could. And then later on, she became Ackfoot right-hand man. She was his legs, really. She would, well, the first lady that would actually participate in politics and go out and do things, but she was doing them for him. And they always discussed what needed to be done. And this is what the Clintons were trying to do, was, be like the Roosevelts. But she was a very close friend of the African Americans and very sensitive to any of the underprivileged. Matter of fact, Mrs. Bethune was a very close personal friend. And many, many African Americans became Democrats because of FDR. They were honest, and they tried to keep, like I say, everybody informed. Black officials were elected in 11 states after that, with Kentucky and Virginia being the only southern states. You got California, Illinois, Kansas, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and Indiana. We've got black officials actually elected. Now, Arthur W. Mitchell changed from a Republican to a Democrat, ran for and run DePriest seat in Chicago in 1934. But we've still got some African Americans who are supporting Al Landon from Kansas in 36, primarily because he was supported by the AME Church. But like I say, the 1930s, blacks are getting elected to local positions, judgeships, and they're either appointed or won an election. And they're going to think they can help not only their own race, but society in general. But by the 1940s, FDR is losing some support in the black community because there's cries of discrimination on some of the relief programs, and there was. But blacks in the North were more interested in foreign politics. Oh, okay, it's supposed to be foreign. And blacks in the South realized there was a game to be played. Who's going to give me the most from my vote? They're beginning to realize that there is power in numbers. But FDR had what they call a black cabinet, and really it's not that. It's a misnomer. It should read Roosevelt's Black Advisory Board or Group, because the country would never have stood for a black cabinet member, or could have gotten by the Senate and been approved. There's too many Southern Democrats in that Congress. Large number of high-profile, intellectual, well-trained, non-political, and what Roosevelt wanted was advice, and he would listen to anyone that would give him advice. He brought academians in from different universities to advise, and it became known as a brain trust. And the policy of seeking advice from the academic world would be used by every succeeding president, because these people were supposed to be non-political. It's a good idea. So he brings in a board of black experts and large numbers of men who were highly visible in the public eye, but like I say, were intellectual, non-political, and I've only got a couple I'm going to tell you about. For instance, Robert Weaver. He was an advisor to the Department of the Interior. He served in the Federal Housing Authority. He served in the Office of the Emergency Management and the War Manpower Department during the war. Very good man. Mary McLeod Bethune, which was a personal friend of the president's wife. She was the president of the National Council of Negro Women, founder and president of the Bethune-Cookman College, and director of the Negro Affairs at the National Youth Administration. Ralph Boucher served on the Library of Congress and Department of State. Now, the entire cabinet worked really hard to end depression and improve conditions of blacks. And there's others mentioned in your text. There's Robert Vaughn, William Hassey, Eugene Nickel Jones. They're all served and all were non-political and all worked to help end depression. But I'm not going to try to inundate you with a list of names. That's like I said, my only complaint about this book is it gives you so many names. Those three I would like you to remember. But just remember there were many, many more. And when it was suggested by white politicians that there should be a black bureau to deal with race matters, the black leaders opposed, because you're just leading to further segregation. And the nice thing is that with the civil service applications, there's no longer a space for race. Just like today, they can't ask you your age, religion, or political affiliation. They used to be able to. And if you were a woman, they wanted to know who was keeping the kids. And if you read this part of the text, you know of the rule of three. The Civil Service Commission would select the top three candidates. And they'd choose a second and third place. And they'd always put a white in number one. But even with this, the civil service rolls gained some 150,000 black employees. Not that they were high-paying jobs. Not even skilled jobs sometimes. It was a small step. But like the famous Chinese philosopher Confucius said, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So the door's open, and we have a small step forward. Government agencies. Oh, we have got government agencies up the yin-yang, and of course they're called the alphabet soup because we all knew them by their initials. FDIC, AAA, FCA, NRA, PWA, CCC, TVA, NYA, WPA, NLRB, SSA, and then go on. And I've got a few listed here with just a little bit telling you what they're going to do. The FDIC, of course, is a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And at that time, they had an insurance of $5,000. I think it's $250,000 now. So if you are a small business and you have your money in the bank and the bank closes, as long as it's $5,000 or less, your guarantee is going to get it back. The AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, paid farmers not to grow. Now that's one of the first things you got to do is supply and demand. Well, okay. Don't grow as much. Well, when you're a farmer and you didn't make enough money last season to feed your family like you wanted to, the first thing you're going to do is grow more this season. And that's only making it worse because the prices were low before, but if you've got more product out there, it's going to be even lower. So we've got to eliminate the supply. So I come around as a government agent and I'll tell you, okay, you've got 100 acres out here in corn, don't plant it. And I'm going to tell you to go south and suck a lemon because I got a plant to take care of my family. And I say, okay, I'll give you what you would have gotten for the crop, just don't grow it. The government's going to give you the money. Well, you're going to give me the money I could have made and I don't have to go out there and work in the heat? Boy, that's a win-win situation. Yeah, but what happens to the person I was paying to help me work the farm? He's not going to get any money. He's not going to get a job. And one of the biggest problems we had was if you come around and tell me not to plant, and I said, well, heck, I can't do that because it's already planted and it's about ready to harvest, so I'll tell you to plow it under. So we had pictures of products being plowed under when we got soup kitchens and soup lines in the cities. A lot of controversy was caused, but it hurt in the short term, but in the long term, it decreased the supply of products and drove the prices up. PWA, Public Works Administration. Now, this was a good one. It got you outside. It hired men to build roads and dams and bridges and warships. And they always made sure on these government programs that they didn't pay you what a union would pay you. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, I think that affected Kentucky more than any of the others. It employed thousands to improve the public lands. And if you ever go to the Cracker Barrel down there on South Predica, they've got some pictures on the wall of young men with no shirts on and baggy breeches, and in the background it looks like you've got some barracks or something out there, and that's members of the CCT. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, we're all familiar with that, down to the LBL, TVA. They built dams to prevent flooding, help erosion, and give cheap electricity. And that was good. Prior to this time, the electric companies had all been privately owned, but this is going to be a public utility. WPA, Works Progress Administration. Now, they did a lot of things that the PWA did. They built schools and hospitals and roads. And for the first time, the very first time, federal money is going to touch the arts program. And they paid people to interview. They paid people to write books. They paid people to make films. It's a marvelous plan. And because of the WPA, a lot of your black writers were able to continue working out from the 20s into the 30s. Of course, the SSA, Social Security Administration, that doesn't need any great deal of explanation. It was originally set up as a dole for widows and orphans. And when it first came around, I think the first checks that went out were like $20 a month. But it did serve a purpose. It kept a lot of people off of, well, it also was supposed to help the blind and the deaf, disabled, and dependent children. I think now we call that SSI, Social Security, something else. Social Security, SSI. I don't remember what it's, but I know it's not regular Social Security. The NYA, the National Youth Administration. Now, this benefited blacks and whites in the field of education and teaches them a trade. The FSA, the Farm Security Administration, gave small loans for farm purchases and to be educated in farming. And this actually helped thousands of African American farmers. But in all honesty, most programs did not benefit the black community because most were for the white male 18 to 25 years old. But the FDIC, the NYA, the FSA, and the CCC and WPA, some blacks benefited. But you got to realize too that all whites didn't benefit either. But there were some complaints against the New Deal. Like I just mentioned, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. Less production means less work. So if I don't have to work and go into plant, I don't have to pay that man to help me. The Wagner Act, mandatory and making it okay to form labor unions. You can do this now, but they began to exclude the black union workers. And of course, the TVA. They flooded 730,000 acres of farmland. They dispossessed 154,000 plus people off the land. Of course, they made the promise that they would never have anything commercial down there. And I think there was a big to-do just a couple of years ago when places like McDonald's and things wanted to come in. Now, I've been down the LBL, and I really enjoyed it down there. There was also the claim that most of the benefits went to Western area states who had not previously supported Democrats, that the blacks in the South were already getting into the Democratic column, so we don't need to send them so much money. There's this grain of truth in it all, of course. There's nothing, everything is all black and white. Like I say, all whites did not benefit, and in the long run, it benefited more people, but in the short run, it did hurt. In Mississippi, a program was set up, and Mrs. Bethune headed the program of Negro Affairs in Washington. And they even appointed some blacks to head some local programs. It managed to last 9 years, employing more than 200,000 black youths. Another one of those small steps. The U.S. Housing Agency was supposed to grant low-cost loans, but they always used the excuse that the black man didn't have the financial backing for it. They were viewed as credit risk. So they made loans to the Federal Public Housing Authority to build low-income projects. Don't get me wrong, there were some gains. The New Deal programs did discriminate against blacks, yes. But there was some progress made toward breaking down traditional patterns of discrimination. Now, even though FDR was a Democrat, he was a Northern Democrat. And the Southern Democrats control the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they hated the New Deal programs. It benefits the blacks and the poor whites. It gave the national government way too much power. You're making the people dependent upon the government for jobs. And we know we got to have strong states' rights. But not being able to get jobs and being poverty-stricken there were several plans about to force white employers to hire the blacks. For instance, a Jobs for Negroes movement was started, and it spread to several different cities. And when the effort to get people to, hire blacks, they would do a boycott, and they'd carry signs, "Don't buy where you can't work." And some of the protesters got a little bit unruly, and there was some violence. But the movement did result in hundreds of African Americans actually gaining employment in Harlem, but they were with jobs that didn't require a lot of skill. In 1935, there was a riot in Harlem, and it began as a protest against the white merchants who wouldn't hire blacks and the white landlords. A black youth was caught stealing and, when chased, escaped, but the rumor of him being beaten to death by whites spread. A mob began to smash stores and run amok, and like any riot, it was used as an excuse to loot stores. In the end, 3 blacks were killed and 200 stores were smashed. More than $2 million in damage was done. Guess what? There was a commission appointed to investigate no matter what happened. The result? Oh, resentment against racial discrimination and poverty. That's what caused the riot. No kidding. How'd they figure that one out? But things began to settle down after the Supreme Court ruled that these people had a right to picket stores that didn't hire blacks. They didn't have a right to riot, but they had a right to picket. And the black labor unions, Section 7 of the NIRA is the right to organize. That the Fair Labor Standards and the Wages and Hours Bill with minimum wage, but there was some opportunities opening. The Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 was the one that was the biggest steps for the worker, because it established a minimum wage and maximum work hours. And anything beyond the 40-hour work week are going to be paid at the rate of time and a half. Now, this is a big step for all workers, but here again, you're leaving out a large group. You're leaving out the domestics and the agricultural workers and a lot of the blacks. Now, I have 4 labor unions listed here. And their full names: John L. Lewis, the white leader of the United Mine Workers, was responsible for the formation of the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO. And he broke with the AFL. He tried to bring the CIO and the United Mine Workers and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and the National Ladies Garment under one union. It wasn't going to work too good. The Steel Workers Organizing Committee was an organization of the steel industry workers, and when it was done, the CIO transferred African American organizers to that organization. The National Union League urged their people to join the CIO's SWOC, Steel Workers Organizing Committee, and if they did, they would receive a contract and pay raises. But both the CIO and AFL, they fought for union members in the meatpacking industry, and this would include some black workers, but they were not made to feel welcome. And the International Ladies Garment Workers, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, they accepted black members, although there's not a lot of blacks employed in the clothing industry. And it's strange that the South fought they fought the integration of the blacks in the Southern mills, but the CIO tried to organize the workers in the Southern mills, but they did not make much headway. There were even separate unions for whites and blacks in Virginia and North Carolina. And there was no way that a Southern worker was going to give up a job that had traditionally been held by a white man for a black man. And more than 30% of the stevedores were black. Remember, it was the stevedores that reached France first during the First War. And why did they have success in that field? Because nobody else wanted the job. It was hot and hard and dirty. The CIO had made a lot of strides in the automobile industry, and since blacks did not have to have special skills for these jobs, they really only constituted about 3.8% of the workforce. A lot of the jobs did become more skilled, and the blacks just didn't have the training. Now, white workers resented the union requiring equal rights for blacks, and there would be a shedding of blood that would not solve the problem. It's going to be World War II before there's much success in that area. Now, with all the unions not wanting blacks and the CIO pushing it when it could, there would be some advances in organizing blacks in the tobacco industry, the aircraft industry, and in the building field. But the CIO's push to abolish racial discrimination, well, it gave hope to some black workers, and because of their stance, blacks began to lose some of their suspicion of labor organizations and were kind of willing to join. Like I say, small steps small steps. Now, syphilis. I know. We're going, where in the world is Mrs. Graves going? Syphilis is a complex sexually transmitted disease, or STD, with a highly variable clinical course. 8 out of the 10 states with the highest rate of syphilis are located in the southern regions of the U.S. Syphilis is passed from person to person through direct contact with a syphilis sore, which is called a canker. And chances mainly occur on, the external genitals, vagina, anus, or rectum, but they also occur on the lips and in the mouth. Transmission of syphilis occurs during vaginal, anal, or oral sex. And pregnant women with the disease can pass it on to their babies. It cannot be spread by toilet seats or doorknobs or swimming pools or hot tubs or baths or shared clothing or even eating utensils. Now, the first symptoms usually appear in 10 to 90 days, with the average being 21. And the first stage is marked by the appearance of a small canker that is firm, round, small, and painless. It usually lasts from 1 to 5 weeks and seems to heal itself on its own. We won't go into the stage, but there is even a dormant period. And the second stage is when one or more areas of the skin develop a non-itching rash. The rash appears rough, and it looks like a copper penny, and you have spots on the palms of your hands and the bottom of your feet. And I'm not going to go into all the signs and stages. But there is a latent stage which begins when the symptoms disappear. So you may think you're cured, but if the infected person has not received treatment, the syphilis, even with no symptoms remains in the body and begins to damage your internal organs, including your brain and your nerves and your eyes, blood vessels, heart, your liver, your bones, and joints. The bacillium, which is a type of penicillin, will cure a person who has had the disease for less than a year. There are no home remedies or over-the-counter drugs that cure. And just washing your genitals or urinating or douching after sex does not prevent syphilis. So any unusual discharge from male or female, sore or rash, especially in your groin area, should be a signal to stop having sex and see a doctor immediately. Like I say, penicillin will cure it if it is less than 1 year old. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because of the Tuskegee study. Now, some of the historical background is some historians believe that syphilis was introduced into Europe in 1493 by crew members returning from Christopher Columbus. However, we have found evidence that some of it did come over that way, but it spontaneously erupted all over the globe about the same time, because we have found bodies that died about this time, and they very definitely have the syphilis holes in their bones, etc. During the 1970s, most cases of syphilis occurred in men with homosexuals. But by 10 years later, it seemed to be among heterosexuals. People who have the AIDS, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, they're more likely to develop a very serious form of syphilis and to suffer relapses even after treatment. But the Tuskegee study is one that we're not too proud of. It seems that back in 1932, the Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute, a very prestigious college, they began to study what is the progress of syphilis? How does it transmit it? How long does it last? And they enrolled 400 poor black men who had syphilis from Alabama. These men were never told they had the disease. They were told that their problem was bad blood. But they gave them free medical exams and free meals and even free burial insurance. Now, in the 1930s, there was no treatment. But by 1947, we did know that penicillin would cure it. But they still received no treatment. And like I said, their stated reason for the study was to study how the disease spreads and kills. Now, these men, they didn't know they had syphilis. They were ignorant. They were poor. Dozens and dozens of men died. And they transmitted the disease to their wives and their children. They didn't know anything about birth control or prophylactics. Finally, the public health workers leaked the story in '73, and there was a class action by the NAACP. And there was a $9 million settlement to the few survivors. Now, I've got that. Where is that paper I was looking for? It makes me mad when I can't find what I want. I had an exact reprint of the newspaper article from the president. It's going to be President Clinton who actually goes on air and delivers an apology. And he actually says the U.S. government was wrong and that we're sorry. And I was so proud of him for doing it because we'd never admitted that we'd done something wrong. And it was a government agency that had done it. But President Clinton delivered an apology for the United States government and actually said, I'm sorry. And next chapter, we'll get into World War II, and we'll spend quite a bit of time seeing what's going on all over the world. And again, thank you for listening.